Good morning, good afternoon, and even good evening, and welcome back to the Dynamic Spectrum Alliance Global Summit 2021. This is day 3 of the event, and we have a very interesting lineup of issues that we're going to be addressing today. We'll start with a panel of national regulators and hear about their experiences from around the world. That will be followed by a session on looking at the economic impact of spectrum sharing. And directly after that, a panel of wireless ISP operators who are often the direct beneficiaries of some of that spectrum sharing. So with just a quick review, all of the sessions in the Dynamic Spectrum Alliance Global Summit are being recorded for DSA's use, and all of the slides from the presentation will be posted by the end of the week. As much as we can, we'll try and take questions and get answers from our speakers. If you look on your GoToWebinar interface, you'll see there's a place there for posting questions. Please post them there and we'll do our best to address them. And now I'd like to turn over to Martha Suarez to give a recap of yesterday's events and some reflections. Martha?
Thank you very much, Steve. And welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us for a third day of the DSA Global Summit. It's a pleasure for us to have you here with us. And today we're going to hear very interesting keynote presentations from regulators representing different countries. Yesterday we had very exciting discussions. We had a fireside chat with acting chairwoman of the FCC, Jessica Rosenworcel, and also keynotes from different speakers from regulators. And then we had a panel with industry perspective about spectrum sharing in North America, Europe, and some technology insights on what's going on. So we hope you have appreciated the content. This year there were less sessions compared to last year, but we tried to really focus on the most important updates. And with that, I also would like to invite you to follow us in social media and to post any messages using the hashtag DSA Global Summit, and also to check online. We are going to have also some additional content that was not live with some pre-recorded sessions. So please feel free to explore that content. Thank you, Steve. Back to you.
Thanks, Martha. Okay, so let's get into our first session where we are going to hear from a number of countries, from Mexico, from South Africa, from Canada, from Costa Rica, and the Czech Republic. Sorry. A brief interruption there. Our first speaker is Javier Juarez Mojica. He's a commissioner with IFT, the National Regulatory Agency in Mexico, and welcome, Javier.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you for the introduction. Good morning, good afternoon, and as you said, even good evening. First of all, I would like to thank you, Martha Suarez. Thank you for the invitation and for the opportunity to speak on behalf of the Federal Telecommunications Institute in this global summit. And thanks to all the people that are attending the summit. Well, in fact, maybe it will be better to say that the people that is following the summit since it is online. Well, anyway, it's my great pleasure to share my views on this topic, a topic that actually is not about the future anymore, but about the present. I would like to speak about the spectrum management approach in Mexico and about the recent development in this field, mainly about the 6 GHz band, an important band not only in Mexico, but all around the world. Next slide, please. Julius Genachowski, a former chairman of the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission in the USA, once said that spectrum is like oxygen for the wireless world. And I agree in some way with him. Spectrum is like oxygen. The COVID-19 pandemic has shown us how important connectivity is. Let me put in this way. Thanks to digital services, we have been able to keep social distance, I mean, staying at home, while doing some productive activities like home office, e-learning, e-commerce. And in fact, thanks to broadband connectivity, we can attend this kind of summits. However, and it's important to point out, not everyone has the same chances to have broadband access. In fact, and because there are some rural areas, mainly, without broadband connectivity, in Mexico, we have used even digital television, broadcast television, and even radio to deliver educational programs to students. In the age of artificial intelligence, 5G, virtual reality, you may think that broadcast television or radio is outdated, and actually I could agree with that. However, those technologies could be the only option for some students. If we want to bridge the digital divide, we need affordable spectrum. And here, let me highlight affordable. If governments want to use spectrum fees as a means to increase the income for the government, for the country, at the end of the day, the deployment of networks will be slower. And actually, the users will pay for that fees, and the services will be less affordable. This could be quite the opposite of a win-win approach. For an efficient spectrum management, it's also very important to look what the other countries are doing and to adopt best practices. What I want to say here is that harmonization is also a very important issue that we as regulators should take into account. So affordable spectrum, harmonization are important issues to help bridge digital divide and to foster innovation. No doubt that it is easier to say than to do, but we as regulators should use these principles as a kind of compass, a compass to guide our work regarding spectrum management. I think that we as regulators should have in mind two main issues: the technical and the legal aspects of the spectrum management. Next slide, please. Regarding the technical issues, I will say something that maybe it will be, let me say, controversial. What I want to say is that the spectrum is not actually a natural resource. And let me explain myself. Spectrum is not like the oil or like the water. We need to create technology if we want to use and to take advantage of the electromagnetic waves of the spectrum. In that sense, the main constraints for the management of these resources are actually the technical. So it is our responsibility to be aware of the technical developments and allow them. And not only allow them, but actually to promote the adoption of those developments. One of those technical approaches is precisely dynamic spectrum access. It's good to see how some organizations as DSA, the host of this summit, are working precisely on this domain. If we promote the use of those new technologies, we are also promoting the efficient use of spectrum, one of the main goals we have as regulators. Next slide, please. Taking that into account, so some years ago, in 2017, our spectrum unit published the report about dynamic access technologies and shared use of spectrum. In this report, they are studying the state of the art in this domain, and they are proposing some recommendations for the best implementation in Mexico of technologies such as LTE on license, emerging technologies based on multi-input, multi-output, MIMO, I mean, TV, white spaces, cognitive radio for dynamic spectrum access, among others. Next slide, please. Technical issues are important, of course, but there are not the only issues we should take into account. The legal or the regulatory framework is also very important. As you may know, we at the Federal Telecommunications Institute, with constitutional autonomy, the highest autonomy we could have according to the constitutional framework in Mexico, we are responsible for the efficient management of the spectrum. And in order to accomplish that, it is within our mandate to enact technical specifications, the rules, to carry out auctions, and as well as to define the use for each band. I mean, mobile or fixed, terrestrial or for satellites, broadcast or broadband, license or unlicensed, and so on. This duty, of course, requires a lot of experience, technical skills, and background. And maybe more important than those skills and knowledge, to be in touch with all stakeholders. I mean, we need to understand, we need to listen which the spectrum requirements are for the service providers, for vendors, and even for the end users, of course. This multi-stakeholder approach is very important for us, and we have the Spectrum Technical Committee. It is open to everyone that is interested on this topic, and within this committee, they could create non-binding recommendations. But even if the recommendations are not binding, they are a very important input for us. This kind of insights help us to reach or to get better decisions regarding the spectrum management. It is also important to point out that as part of the decision-making process, we need to carry out public consultation. For example, if we want to say that one specific band will be used as unlicensed spectrum, before we reach a final decision, we will carry out a public consultation. This is another way to take into account all the points of view regarding spectrum management. Next slide, please. Thanks to this approach, and although I recognize that there is always room for improvement, I would like to say that, in my view, the regulatory framework in Mexico allows the efficient use of the spectrum. For example, we are allowing spectrum leasing, spectrum sharing, and secondary use. This kind of regulations allows the use of a spectrum in a very efficient way, at least in my view. Next slide, please. Finally, and I think it's important to share with you one specific example, let me say a kind of outcome of the regulatory process. Just 1 week ago, we started a public consultation regarding the 6 gigahertz band. Currently, the spectrum unit is proposing to use the 1200 megahertz as unlicensed spectrum for low power indoors and very low power indoors as well as outdoors. In order to get to this draft, the spectrum unit worked a lot, of course, and actually in some way this will be like a second public consultation in this topic, because some months ago they carried out other consultation. I mean, we conducted a kind of survey to gather information, in points of view, insights that have been very useful to write the draft, and now is on public consultation. It's important to point out that this is not a final decision, but a draft to listen to all stakeholders. I mean, they can send us every comment they may have, and we are committed to study them and to provide them an answer. Next slide, please. Actually, that was the last slide. Thank you very much for the chance to share these views with you. With this picture, I would like to illustrate, to show that with the spectrum, with telecom towers, with networks, we will bridge the digital divide. Connectivity is one of the main tools to create a better world, and for that, spectrum is of paramount importance. Thank you very much.
Gracias, Javier. It is inspiring to hear the work that Mexico is doing. I'm particularly a fan of the community-owned networks that are being developed thanks to the affordances of IFT in the state of Oaxaca. Next up, we have South Africa, and we are fortunate enough to have two counselors from ICASA, the Independent Communications Authority of South Africa. Welcome, Peter Zimri, and welcome, Yolisa Kadama.
Good afternoon, Steve. Am I audible?
Good afternoon.
We can hear you clearly.
Great. Thank you very much, Steve. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending where you are connecting from. As Steve said, my name is Peter Zimri. I'm one of the counselors at the Independent Communications Authority of South Africa. And as many countries around the world, we are also sort of called commissioners, I think, with other regulators. And then we also stand on the protocol that was already established by previous speakers, and greeting to the ministers if there are any present on the call. The director for the BR, Mr. Mario Manovich, that was also part of, I think, earlier discussions, and the R2 Secretary General, Mr. John Obo, the color policy, and also color policymakers, regulatory authorities, distinguished participants. I also just would like to thank the Dynamic Spectrum Alliance, Martha and the team, for this invitation and for the platform. I will certainly share this time slot with my colleague, fellow councillor, Yolisa Kadama. I will do the initial part of the presentation, and then I will hand over to her after slide number 6. Can you maybe just go to the next slide? Great, thank you. This is basically just an outline of our presentation where, as I mentioned early on, I will touch on our organizational mandate as ICASA, we regulate in South Africa, also the spectrum management framework, our localized regulatory framework, and then our councillor, Yolisa Kadama, will also look at our spectrum priorities and spectrum sharing matters, and further give an update on the dynamic spectrum sharing initiative in South Africa, which we sort of concluded. If you can maybe go to the next slide.
Oui.
Can we go to the next slide, please? Great, thank you. Well, I think this is supposed to be a slide. I also want to echo the colleague from Mexico. It's a well-established principle that the radio frequency spectrum is a finite resource which requires prudent spectrum management. This is the primary reason why we're here today discussing innovative ways to share this scarce, valuable resource. We also recognize the radio frequency spectrum is and has become extremely useful and necessary for further development of our economies, especially the developing nations, thus enabling voice broadband services for our citizens. As my colleague also mentioned earlier from Mexico, the COVID-19 pandemic has shown us that more than ever, access to broadband connectivity is essential to operate remotely, and spectrum are central to sustain and improve capacity on our networks. And as operators, they need to reconfigure the networks as Africans are now moving towards the edge of these networks where our people live, especially the underserviced areas that we have to cater for, and they sort of connect the unconnected. In this regard, South Africa, in collaboration with our partners, our research institutions, have been involved in studies regarding the concept of dynamic spectrum sharing, and recognize the need for innovate existing static spectrum management paradigms and looking towards innovative spectrum management systems. Spectrum management reform is critical to meet the demands of future wireless networks, and is required to meet our obligations to connect the unconnected. Can you maybe go to the next slide, please? On the next slide, basically, we just want to outline our regulatory mandate as ICASA. We are a constitutional institution, and we are established in terms of an ICASA Act, or a law, a decree, as it's known in other jurisdictions. And as a regulator, we have this all-inclusive broad mandate to regulate electronic communications, broadcasting, and postal sectors in the public interest. We are also mandated to ensure affordable and high-quality services to all our citizens. The block on the slide at the bottom sort of just outline our laws and basically where our spectrum management mandate is grounded in spectrum policy and also within our electronic communications laws. If you can go to the next slide, please. On the next slide, we basically just providing our spectrum management institutional framework. And as many countries, we do have a similar system or institutional framework on spectrum. Safe to say that we participate extensively in the IQ statutes, which forms basically the foundation of our spectrum management framework and also our national table of frequency allocations. I was honored and privileged to chair the last WRC 19 preparatory work, and also to chair the African group at WRC 19 in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt. So I possibly interacted with quite a few people on this call during that conference and so on, being on the steering committee of the International Telecommunications Union, WRC. We are also a member of the African Telecommunications Union, where we coordinate and ensure that we, to a large extent, harmonize our spectrum issues within on the continent of Africa, and ensure that we harmonize our positions towards the developments of international spectrum instruments. For those that attended yesterday's session, possibly heard the presentation from the R2 Secretary General, Mr. John Omo, in respect of developments of work on the continent. In this regard, we are in the process of finalizing our spectrum management recommendations. What we intend doing is a harmonized African spectrum band plan. We are also looking towards emerging technology trends, which is a document that we also will be validating in a few coming weeks and months. In one of the presentations in the early hours of yesterday morning, I was sort of woke up in the early hours of the morning around the developments of the 6 GHz spectrum and the WRC agenda items. I saw an indication of many initiatives on the future of Wi-Fi needs around the world. With, I think, the continent, except for Egypt, which has some consultation on the topic on the 6 GHz band. But I just want to mention that as up to member states, we are certainly, and we had extensive debates and deliberations, each in the process of finalizing those discussions on the 6 GHz bands, additional Wi-Fi spectrum, and so on, and looking at also other sharing criteria that we might or might not implement. I also just want to mention it's also not easy to harmonize amongst 55 sovereign member states, and that is one of the difficulties that we must be facing on the African continent. But the harmonization of spectrum and the usage now more than ever, as we implement the African Common Free Trade Agreement, I think harmonization of spectrum for our citizens to roam amongst the member states and do business on the continent among our member states becomes so much more important, and there is a renewed interest to harmonize all spectrum activities on the continent. Furthermore, as part of the SADC economic group, the 16 member states, for years we established and maintained a harmonized frequency allocation table, and also the channel arrangement to a large extent they are also harmonized. But there are some country-specific issues, but I think in the main we are harmonized in terms of the usage on the within SADC. As South Africa, we also have to coordinate with our 6 neighbors, where our spectrum plans are done. Whatever spectrum plan that will come up and channel plans that will come up, we have to coordinate with our 6 neighbors. And as with some of our countries or neighboring states, the Kingdom of Eswatini and the Kingdom of Lesotho, we basically surrounding these countries, and whatever plans we put in place, we have to coordinate with them and ensure that whatever plans have been developed has to consider effective cross-border interference analysis. In the country, we have a joint spectrum responsibility. If you can see the local environment, with the policymaker, the Department of Communications and Digital Technologies, which is responsible for the international coordination and the approval of the National Table of Frequency Allocations. In terms of the laws, the DCT, our Department of Communications and Digital Technologies, is responsible for international coordination with the ITU, our preparatory work for WRCs and all other international engagements. As ICASA, on the other hand, we are responsible to implement the international agreements, and we aim to and also the development of the South African radio frequency allocation table. We are also responsible for the channel arrangement, and these channel arrangements are normally radio frequency assignment plans, which we have to ensure that effective and efficient use of radio frequency spectrum is done, and amongst others, establish the technical criteria to share these frequency bands. If you look at the bottom end of that slide where it says others, we do have other entities that are key role players in spectrum management in South Africa. We do have the Department of Science and Innovation, responsible for radio astronomy, where we have the Square Kilometre Array, the South African National Space Agency that deals with satellite matters, the Department of Health that deals with the radiation effects, and the Civil Aviation Authority that deals with aviation safety, and our South African Maritime Authority deals with maritime safety and communications. So if you can move to the next slide, I will give us sort of a perspective on our spectrum regulatory framework in South Africa. And then I will hand over to my colleague, Councillor Kidama. So in South Africa, as a regulator, we are required by law to do extensive public consultation in establishing regulations and licensing processes. If you can go to the next slide, please. We are also obligated by law to publish all of the seasons what we call governing gazettes, which is what it first you look like on the slide. If I can pull up the slide for us. Right, I will basically cut my presentation short. Basically, so our consultation process culminated into band plans where we basically the radio frequency sound plans that gives us the sharing criteria and shared bands, and also sort of give us the channel plans that we have to use to license our spectrum. What I also just want to mention in closing is that our spectrum regulatory or licensing framework is technology neutral, and however, spectrum sharing agreements and spectrum pooling agreements need to be filed with authority for us for consideration to do a competition assessment, spectrum interference analysis, and also to ensure that there are synergies within the shared bands by the spectrum holdings. Let me hand over to my colleague, Councillor Kidama, please.
Thank you so much, Councillor Zimri. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all the colleagues around the call. If you can just go back just one slide for me to just quickly go through that slide again. Thank you so much. So just to take over from where Councillor Zimri left off, in South Africa, we do assign spectrum in a number of ways. We have the exclusive, the shared, or the unlicensed. So for exclusive, what it means is that no one else can use that spectrum in that specified environment where the license has been given. So the license is given more with usage rights, not necessarily property rights, and transferability will depend on the band and the terms and conditions of the license that we're talking about. For shared spectrum, we have multiple users. We give them the right to share and to use the same spectrum. It's also in a form of a license, but with limiting requirements so that we can avoid interference. And we also have the commons. With this, we allow unlimited use or unlimited number of users to share the same spectrum. Interference amongst the users is avoided by technical standards and etiquette. The users of unlicensed spectrum cannot claim protection from interference. And also there is no need to obtain a license as mentioned, but equipment should be approved for use by the authority, that is ICASA. Next slide, please. Yes, just to explain the different ways we authorize the usage, we have two options, the individual authorizations and general authorizations. For individual, we issue licenses and we have authorized primary use that is split into two, exclusive access and shared primary access. For exclusive, it's already explained in the previous slide. But for shared primary access, the example that we can give is the mobile versus broadcasting services that sometimes are given the equal status, co-primary status. Also under the individual authorization is the authorized secondary use, meaning shared spectrum secondary access. This is an example of our E-band with authorized shared access. Actually, within the E-band, we've got two licensing regimes. We've got part licensed and also authorized spectrum access. Then under the general authorizations, which is more license exempt or unlicensed, we've got also the shared spectrum secondary access. The example there with our TV white spaces, that's where we license them, or at least we authorize them. And then the commons, which is also a form of shared access. But the example with this one is the Wi-Fi's. You don't need any licensing for this one. The next slide, please. Okay, our priorities currently is the auctioning of the IMT spectrum. The bands identified for auctioning is the 700, the 800, the 2600, and the 3500 megahertz bands. The invitation to apply was out last year, so there's a process that is going on with that one that I will not get into details about. And also our other priority is the issue with the temporary spectrum that we have given to the operators, and the assignments for that is again the 700, the 800, the 2300, the 2600, and the 3500 megahertz bands. And those licenses, we've extended the temporary spectrum licenses until the 31st of August. For that, spectrum sharing and pooling is allowed during this period of the pandemic. So there are also obligations that have been given for those temporary licenses for virtual classrooms and zero rating educational websites. The third one being the V and the E bands. The regulations and registration database already published, with the V band on license exempt, and the E band, as mentioned, part licensing, and also the other part coordinated amongst the users. The standard operating procedures are already in place since 2017 for that. There is also sharing of fixed services frequency bands, where microwave links get to share with broadband fixed wireless access, obviously with terms and conditions for that. And then the last one, which is not necessarily the last, but amongst the top priorities, which is the dynamic and opportunistic spectrum access. That is the TV white spaces right now. So the framework is already completed, and the process, the regulations came into force on the 1st of April this year. So the operators are busy deploying. Next slide. Just to go through the roadmap for the TV white spaces, we had trials between 2012 and 2014, and then there was a discussion paper developed 2015. We had a findings document there after 2016, and then the position paper with the draft regulations in 2017. Then we finalized the regulations in 2018. Then the process of the reference database in 2019, followed by the secondary geolocation spectrum database in 2020. And then we developed a framework to qualify the secondary database service providers in 2020. Then, as mentioned, the implementation of those came into force on the 1st of April this year, 2021. You can go to the next slide. The next slide, please. Okay, just to quickly go through the architecture of the TV white spaces, we've got the reference database, which is the master, and then we've got a number of secondary database providers, more of a replica of the reference database. but operated by certified secondary geolocations spectrum database providers. And then at this stage, we've only managed to certify just one secondary database provider. But we are still open for whoever that qualifies the application process. And then there are white space devices. There's a protocol to access the white space devices, and the approved or certified secondary database providers are on a website, and we do update that as and when we get new ones certified by ICASA, and the front office or being at ICASA offices. The next slide. The next slide, thank you. Just in conclusion, as we recognize that the different governments and regulators around the world, they are taking the next steps in the evolution of spectrum policies. Spectrum management reform is very critical, with dynamic spectrum access between a traditional exclusive allocation and the spectrum commons. As mentioned, we did publish this position paper on dynamic and opportunistic spectrum management in 2017, with the first phase being the implementation of the TV white spaces, mainly to promote efficient and effective use, and given the high demand for this scarce spectrum, and also the demand for the growing capacity, which is exceeding the available spectrum. So the second phase, in collaboration with our research partner, CSIR, we busy initiating the research processes on more innovative ways for future spectrum management, just because these technologies and techniques ensure that consumers and their devices have wireless bandwidth and when they need it. I think that will be the end of our presentation. Thank you very much. Back to you, Steve and Martha.
Thank you very much to you both, and I think it was a very interesting overview, and we look forward with anticipation to see the release of more spectrum in the coming months. Thank you very much. And now we turn to Canada, and I'd like to welcome Shalini Periyalwar. She is an expert director at the Ministry of Innovation, Science and Economic Development, or ISED, as most people usually say, which is responsible for spectrum management in Canada. Welcome.
Thank you. Good morning, good day to everybody from all parts of the world. And thank you to DSA and to Martha for inviting ISED's participation in this international panel. I will be presenting on behalf of ISED a view of upcoming spectrum releases in Canada, with an emphasis on bands that will allow shared use of spectrum. Next slide, please. For some background, let's begin with looking at ISED's most recent spectrum outlook priorities that were released as a decision in 2018. A subset of the priority 1 bands to be released over the 4 years from 2018 to 2022 is shown here for low band spectrum, mid band spectrum, and for high band spectrum. Since the outlook decision, some bands were upgraded to priority 1. And these additional bands include the 6 GHz band and the 3800 MHz band. Today, I will focus primarily on the bands that touch upon spectrum sharing, namely the 6 GHz band, as well as some recent developments in the TV whitespace band, which is not shown here. I'll also share with you some information on other priority bands, particularly in the mid bands and the high bands. Next slide, please. As the South African speaker articulated with respect to TV whitespace in South Africa, in Canada as well, a consultation for TV whitespace happened as early as 2011. And throughout the years that followed, we've been making modifications to the rules for the TV whitespace framework to align with our peer regulators as well as with industry standards. Our latest proposed technical rules free up more TV whitespace channels to support broadband services in rural and remote communities in Canada. As of April 2021, the good news is that TV whitespace is fully operational in Canada. Red Technologies has been approved as a whitespace database administrator as of February of this year. We are seeing interest from other database administrators as well to enter the market. We've also whitespace devices certified as of this year, and we expect more to be certified going forward. Services and service providers offering to wish services or deploy systems using whitespace technologies and whitespace devices are now able to do so on a license exempt basis. And this is an economical approach to providing services that are appealing to a segment of customers. Wireless ISPs have started deploying TV whitespace technologies commercially in Canada, starting in the rural areas. Next slide, please. Moving on to 6 GHz band, ISED released a consultation in November of 2020, followed by a decision in May of 2021. In the decision, ISED decided to closely align with the US decision for license exempt use of the band. After carefully weighing the priorities, the pros and cons of assigning the full band versus a portion of the band to license exempt use, ISED made a decision to allow license exempt use in all 1200 megahertz of the band. Now, with the use of the band, with the use of full band by license exempt devices, ISED concluded that the socioeconomic benefits will be immediate and will only improve in the coming years as new and innovative uses emerge. License exempt ecosystems are already becoming available for use in the band, as we have heard from speakers in other sessions. And the planned roadmaps for equipment evolution look promising, be it for Wi-Fi or for 5G NRU or for other technologies. Many of the speakers during the sessions of the past 2 days have clearly made a case for license exempt use in all 1200 megahertz of the band, and they have particularly noted the powerful benefits of Wi-Fi 7. Low power indoor only Wi-Fi devices are permitted in the full 1200 megahertz of the band from 5925 to 7125 megahertz. Very low power indoor and outdoor Wi-Fi devices are also permitted in the full 1200 megahertz of the band. Standard power indoor and outdoor Wi-Fi devices under the control of a spectrum sharing database system are permitted in 950 megahertz of the band, between 5925 megahertz and 6875 megahertz. Now, compared with the US, we've allowed an additional 100 megahertz of standard power use between 6425 and 6525 megahertz. The difference in the case of standard power devices with respect to use in the US is that in Canada, the nature of incumbent use in the 6425 to 6525 megahertz subband permits the introduction of standard power devices in this band, as there are no broadcast auxiliary services in this subband. There are, however, broadcast auxiliary services in the 6875 to 7125 portion of the subband. Therefore, Canada did not introduce standard power devices in this subband. As was pointed out by one of the speakers yesterday, globally, this is by far the largest amount of spectrum assigned by a regulator for use with a spectrum sharing database. For low power and very low power devices, we have relied on the power limits that we have listed on the slide and building attenuation losses to mitigate the likelihood of harmful interference to incumbents. I will talk about the incumbents and the protection mechanisms for standard power devices in the next slide. Finally, we're moving quickly to release the technical rules for the band. A consultation is already out for the technical rules applicable to low power devices and for very low power devices in the coming months. We will follow with the technical rules for standard power devices and very low power devices in the coming months. Next slide, please. So there are 4 classes of key incumbent users in the band that require protection from standard power or LANs. There is an abundance of fixed services as well as fixed satellite services in the band. Additionally, in parts of the band, we have broadcast auxiliary services as well as radio astronomy services. The fixed services will be protected with the use of an AFC system. The AFC system will implement exclusion zones to protect the fixed services. It is understood that the AFC system will determine the permissible frequencies and power of operation for license-exempt services. Similarly, radio astronomy services will also be protected through an exclusion zone managed by the AFC. To protect fixed satellite services, primarily Earth to space operations in this band, we will restrict antenna elevation angles from pointing upwards for outdoor devices. And we will do this with the use of a vertical elevation mask, which imposes power limits on outdoor or land devices. For the broadcast auxiliary services, as I mentioned earlier, the main mitigation measure will not be allowing standard power outdoor or on the overlapping frequencies. And for indoor devices and services, or LANs, we will be relying on power limits and building attenuation to provide protection to the broadcast auxiliary services. Next slide, please. I would like to touch briefly upon the 3800 megahertz band. During May 2021, ICED released the decision on the technical and policy framework for the 3650 to 4200 megahertz band, as well as changes to the frequency allocation of the 3500 to the 3650 megahertz band. The incumbent licensees in the 3650 to 4200 megahertz band are wireless broadband services and downlink earth stations for FSS in the C band. Both the earth stations are both licensed as well as license exempt. For this band, we've decided to make a total of 330 megahertz of spectrum available for 5G services, with a 20 megahertz guard band as illustrated in the diagram below. We will also make within this 330 megahertz, we will make the 3900 to the 3980 megahertz available for shared use for wireless broadband services. This 80 megahertz of spectrum is in response to the growing needs of spectrum users in the WBS band, which is currently at 3650 to 3700 megahertz. The shared use band between 3900 to 3980 will allow spectrum users in the band to provide wireless internet and other services using 5G equipment. In addition to rural wireless ISP use, the band will be used for private networks to serve new and emerging use cases, such as for mines, utilities, factories, and other verticals. With respect to the exact method of shared use in the band, ICED will consult on a new licensing process in the future. And this will include the licensing approach, the license areas, the conditions of license, and so on. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, we've looked at sharing in the 3900 megahertz band, and where we designated 80 megahertz for shared use in the band. And this band will provide the additional 30 30 megahertz for rural wireless ISPs. And I mentioned all these points in the previous slide. So moving on to the next slide, please. So aside from the decisions related to the specific bands for spectrum sharing, we have also reviewed or have been reviewing the foundational requirements for spectrum sharing from a spectrum management perspective. So under these studies, we're looking at the quality of incumbent data in various bands of interest for spectrum sharing, because the incumbent data needs to be of high quality, where we define quality as being adequate, accurate, and up to date. In order to protect the incumbents, we need good quality data. And so this is important, and an emphasis is being placed on ensuring high quality data as we go forward, as we introduce new licensees and make changes to the use of the band. We're also looking at the regulatory processes and technologies, and evaluating investments into cloud computing, spectrum monitoring, and other technologies that will support efficient spectrum management. In addition, ICET is also reviewing the regulatory and legal frameworks towards ensuring that it is DSA ready and future-proof. Last but not least, we are mindful of the Canadian context of the potential business case for ecosystem players in spectrum sharing. Next slide, please. Recently, a broadcasting and telecom review was completed in 2020, and some of the recommendations in the review touch upon spectrum sharing. We're also examining the enhancements needed to spectrum management software, as I mentioned earlier, in anticipation in support of spectrum sharing, including demands for compliance and enforcement in the sharing band. Next slide, please. Finally, to complete the picture on the upcoming spectrum releases in Canada, I have a couple of slides on some auction bands. The auction for the 3500 megahertz band will begin very soon on June 15th, 2021. The band is divided into 20 blocks of 10 megahertz each, and licenses will be auctioned for a 20-year term. And for smaller and regional competitors, a 50 megahertz set aside will apply in most areas. Next slide, please. For the millimeter wave bands, during 2019, ICET issued its decision on releasing millimeter wave spectrum to support 5G. And the key decisions here include 4.85 gigahertz of total spectrum in the 26 gigahertz band, the 28 gigahertz band, and the 37 to 40 gigahertz band, available for fixed as well as for mobile services. The band plans that we've shown here are aligned with international standards, and measures will be put in place to ensure coexistence between fixed and mobile services and various satellite services in the 26 gigahertz, 28 gigahertz, and the 37 to 40 gigahertz band. Also, there is 7 gigahertz of spectrum in the 64 to 71 gigahertz part of the band that is being made available for license-exempt use. For the 26 gigahertz, 28 gigahertz, and the 37.6 to 40 gigahertz bands, ICET will consult further on the licensing and auction framework. Next slide, please. So in closing, I would like to highlight that ICET is committed to ensuring efficient use of spectrum across low bands, mid bands, and high bands. Spectrum sharing will be one of the tools that will be used to ensure spectrum is efficiently deployed. To that end, we have introduced database-driven spectrum sharing in the TV white space band and in the 6 gigahertz band. ICET is also reviewing its processes and technologies so as to stay agile and prepare for the next generation of spectrum management. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, Shalini. That was Very, very interesting and a comprehensive review of the various spectrum bands that are under review with ISED. I wasn't aware that the TV white space was now active in Canada, and that's very exciting to hear.
It's very exciting.
It's been a long time coming. Now we turn to Costa Rica, and I would like to welcome Glenn Fallas, who's the General Director of Quality of Service and the Spectrum Department at SUTEL in Costa Rica. Welcome, Glenn. Hello, Glenn, are you there? Perhaps while we're locating Glenn, we could perhaps start with Pavel Sistek, Head of Policy and Strategy with the Czech Telecommunication Office. Pavel, are you available?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay, well let's move on, and we'll bring Glenn back as soon as we can sort out what the challenge is there. Let's go forward with your presentation. Welcome.
Thank you. And good morning, everyone, or good afternoon.
Sorry to interrupt, Pavel. I just got a message from Glenn. He had lost connectivity, but I think he's back. Sorry, Pavel.
Sorry about the confusion. Glenn, welcome, and we will proceed as planned. Over to you.
Hi, thank you, Steve. I'm sorry for the inconvenience with the connection, and well, thank you also.
It's possible I spoke too soon. We'll see what we can do to get Glenn back. Just hang on 1 minute.
In the meantime, Steve, there is a question if you want to take it from the audience, just in case.
Sure. There's while we're waiting for Glenn, there's a question for ICASA, and so Peter or Yulisa, if you're available, for the spectrum that is not being auctioned, what principles or algorithms do you apply or plan to adopt for the pricing of spectrum assignments?
Steve, can you hear me?
Yeah, loud and clear, Peter. Go ahead.
Okay, great. Thanks. Maybe Yulisa can also chip in. Yeah, the spectrum that we don't auction, we do have a framework, a spectrum pricing framework, which we charge the current operators, which is what we call an administrative incentive pricing. They have in the UK. So, and all the formulas contain, you can basically pay for spectrum in a small geographic location, and also through a spectrum assignment that is throughout the country. So there is a spectrum pricing formula that we deploy when we charge for spectrum through this administrative incentive pricing regulation that we published. There is a publication that we can share with our colleagues if that's needed. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. That was very helpful. Glenn, how are we doing now? Are you able to? Can we hear you? Can you go ahead, please?
Yes, I hear you well. Thank you, Steve. I'm sorry for the connection issues. Well, can we put the next slide, please, to begin the presentation, please? Okay, this is the issues that I will touch during my presentation. We have the recent National Frequency Allocation Plan update in Costa Rica. I will talk also about the only censored spectrum in our country, also the type approval process, and some of the new options with the recent National Frequency Allocation Plan update of IMT spectrum and high altitude platforms. And also I will talk about Earth stations in motion, new changes with the National Frequency Allocation Plan. Next slide, please. Okay, this is the description of the National Frequency Allocation Plan recent modification. Would you please go to the next slide? Well, as the other panelists were pointed, we run these public consultations on the changes on the National Frequency Allocation Plan. We started by a modification proposal. This proposal is done by a public consultation, and SUTEL and ICT Ministry will take all the positions received during the consultation and issue the final text of the National Frequency Allocation Plan. This is the first time that we receive a lot of international positions in terms of the opinions on the changes of the National Frequency Allocation Plan. This process took six months, and we touched the IMT spectrum, the only censored spectrum, and also high altitude platforms and Earth stations in motion. The decreed publication was on April 30th, and that's why it is very recent. So would you please go to the next slide? Well, SUTEL has been very supportive on the only censored spectrum allocation, and these are the main bands that we use for the only censored spectrum allocation. We have the 900 megahertz band. We have there the ISM block of FCC spectrum, but we also have a mixed spectrum allocation with licensed fixed links on 928 to 940, and also only censored use of a spectrum. And this same picture replicates on the 947 gigahertz and up. So we have a lot of only censored spectrum room for applications like IoT. We have had a lot of type approval requests for IoT devices. So please take into account that we run a lot of free only censored spectrum on the 900 megahertz band. We also have the regular 2.4 and 5.8 gigahertz band for all the wireless access points and wireless routers. And would you please put the next slide? Well, this is the biggest change on the update of the National Frequency Allocation Plan. We have the full 1.2 gigahertz allocation of only censored band spectrum. We have the low power indoor applications that those are the limits shown on the table. We have a maximum equivalent isotropic radiated power of 30 dBm, and we also enable the very low power use with an equivalent isotropic radiated power of 14 dBm. For Costa Rica, we think that small countries like ours have to take advantage of the economies of scale. So we have seen, like all the panelists present, that the 6 gigahertz band is one of the possible harmonization bands on worldwide harmonization bands of the only sensed use of a spectrum. So for our country, it's very important to take advantage of these new technologies. And we will, with this allocation, we will enable these 7 wide channels of 160 megahertz that will enable all the Wi-Fi 6E new possibilities in terms of the speeds and low latency. Would you go to the next slide, please? As I told before, we are very supportive on the only sensitive spectrum, so we also support the no change for the 60 gigahertz band for WiGig. I think that most of people recall the discussions taken in the World Radio Communications Conference in 2019 about this band. So we support the only sensed band. In terms of the benefits that we could take from them, let's say that in Costa Rica we have around 200 service providers, and maybe more than half are based only on only sensed spectrum. So for our country, it is very important the amount of spectrum that we can deploy for new use cases and for the fixed point-to-point and mobile uses of only sensed band spectrum. Would you please go to the next slide? Well, we also enable these smart transportation bands according to the ITUR recommendation M1452 and M2057. We enable a lot of we enable higher output powers. In this time it is around 55 dBms, and we have had a lot of requests for approvals recently regarding this application. We have a lot of vehicle interest on this smart automatization of the transport of public transportation. So we also are behind this 76 to 81 gigahertz band. Okay, would you please put the next slide? Well, one other thing that we would like to point out is that we have a type approval process. It is very consolidated process in Costa Rica. We have a website where everyone interested in having the approval in Costa Rica can issue the request. We have two main process there. We have the mobile devices that they test the interaction with the local networks, with the local mobile networks, and also the protection of the mask and the SAR levels. And we also have the type approval process for the only sensed bands. They will be the testing for them to comply with the National Frequency Allocation Plan limits, like I showed before. Would you go to the next slide, please? Okay, one of the new advantages of the update of the National Frequency Allocation Plan is that with only sensed band, we could also touch some of the IMT bands, maybe focus on millimeter wave bands and also high altitude platforms. Here we show that we have allocate 14 gigahertz of IMT spectrum that it is the higher amount of spectrum that we have dedicated to one application. This is regarding the IMT 2020 or 5G bands. We have some challenges to give the spectrum in an orderly way and to reorganize the current allocations of the spectrum. But there is a lot of available spectrum in the lower bands, in the mid bands, and the millimeter wave bands. So we are in the process, and we are talking with the ICT ministry, and they are evaluating a request for Sutel to initiate an auction process for 5G spectrum. So as you see, this recent National Frequency Allocation Plan update enables a lot of spectrum for IMT services also. We have had some comments about the 6 gigahertz band for only censored use, and what we have say is that we have 14 gigahertz of IMT spectrum, and we think that we can have room for also for only censored bands, because this is an ecosystem and you can share the spectrum with the different applications available. Could you go to the next slide, please? Okay, this is the spectrum allocation for high altitude platforms. For us, it is very important to review this kind of applications. We have seen a lot of tests for this concept, and the last week I was at a conference where I asked some people from Facebook and other providers if they were willing to test the high altitude platform concept in Latin America. And so please review that we have allocated more than 6 gigahertz of a spectrum for this application, and we are ready to run any kind of test of the concept of these new platforms that they show they are very reliable to disaster disaster recovery of the networks, and also to get connectivity to rural areas. So we are very prepared for testing this new concept and show the benefits of these applications. Could you please go to the next slide? Well, this is the Earth stations in motion. This is the spectrum that enables the Wi-Fi on board, and we have this request to review the current rules in our National Frequency Allocation Plan, and now with this update we can issue the license for anyone to use the spectrum in Costa Rica to get these applications. According to Resolution 169, sorry, and Resolution 156, we have established the rules for the Earth station in motion operation in our country. This is all the information that I have to share, and thank you very much for your attention. Next slide, please, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Glenn. I think we have time for one quick question from the audience, and that's from Carol Souza Leguizamon. Will Sutel also allow low power use for outdoor scenarios in the 6 gigahertz band?
Well, currently we review the positions that we receive. We have some fixed links allocations in that band. We will have to review again the conditions, because I have seen also the standard power option with the database to try to do the spectrum sharing. But currently the only available use is indoor. But as I tell you, we can review these rules, and we are very open to discuss this kind of technical aspects with anyone. So please send me an email or get in touch with me, and we can review these kind of rules and try to get a new update of the National Frequency Allocation Plan. Thank you.
Thank you very much again, Glenn. And now, last but not least, from the Czech Republic, welcome Pavel Sistek, Head of Policy and Strategy Unit at the Czech Telecommunications Unit. Over to you, Pavel.
Thank you, Steve. And good morning, everyone, or good afternoon. And firstly, I would like to thank for inviting me for this DSA summit. It's a very nice event. And next minutes, I will speak about the experiences about spectrum sharing in the Czech Republic. Next, please. So my name is Pavel Sistek, and I'm from the Czech Telecommunication Office. And my responsibility are strategies and policies, and of course, spectrum management. Next, please. Well, I would like to speak about spectrum sharing in reality. And spectrum sharing is sometimes about benefiting or about finding benefits from for society, but taking it into account risks. Then I will show two examples of national approach on spectrum sharing based on licensing approach. And of course, then I will mention a little bit something about software sharing. It's another issue. And then I will touch a bit the harmonization within Europe, and I will comment a little bit the opportunities for the harmonization within the upper part of the 6 GHz band. And finally, a few words about 5G. Next slide, please. Well, spectrum sharing, this is a matter of dealing with interferences and on one side, and on the other side to take into account the prosperity and the benefits of society, and of course to learn new approaches. And within Europe there are several research and development activities, and for example, one summary has been published via RSPG, a report on spectrum sharing. RSPG, it's a Radio Spectrum Policy Group. It's an advisory body of European Commission. And there are some examples of what has been done or what can be done in this area. Among some ideas, there is, for example, the idea to foster efficient use of spectrum, then to foster innovations and to introduce new technologies. So from geolocation through blockchain up to AI or maybe other cloud solutions. Here there is one important prerequisite. It's the knowledge of the actual use of spectrum usage. So availability of information about spectrum is very important. And finally, last but not least, it's one important issue. As Europe consists of many countries, we need collaborative effort or approach. Next, please. Well, this is an example of national approach on light licensing within the 60 GHz band. It has been mentioned several times during this summit. So here in the Czech Republic, we decided to introduce light licensing for one reason. The band is already used by fixed service. So there are some microwave links and they need some protection. And as WiGig technology is a little bit different from fixed service, we decided to introduce some coordination tools into a new platform. So the platform is a website, it's a portal, and we call it Coordination Calculator. So the Coordination Calculator are elements based on ITUR recommendations that are used for fixed service coordination and even for other services. And this all is implemented within the portal, within a new website, and it means that users are spectrum managers. So users can manage and install and register stations. Of course, it needs a few experience, but we have a guide for them, so it works. We launched it in January 2020, therefore it helped us to go through the COVID-19 pandemic, and today we have more than 55,000 stations, so it helps us to bring the connectivity or to foster the competition. So it means we do not have so big problems with the coverage, but with the competition. So it's very important to if the platforms compete. Next, please. Well, another example of spectrum sharing is opening of the band 5.8 gigahertz. It's for Arlands, and it's been already mentioned by previous speakers that it's a very useful band, and it's an extension of the already harmonized or globally harmonized bands for Wi-Fi. But in some countries in Europe, it's utilized by incumbents. So the incumbents are military radars and road tolling systems. These road tolling systems are fixed installations on roads. So what to do with that? We made some studies and came to the conclusion that protection zones, geographical static protection zones, is a good solution to handle both needs. And we implemented it into that website. And therefore, all stations with EIRP higher than 25 millivolts can use this band, but they are not allowed to operate within the protection zones. And in addition, all stations with power higher than with power higher than 200 milliwatts, they have to be registered. So it's quite easy. And of course, we implemented some elements of automation, so it's not the case or individual manually installation, but also batch file functionality have been introduced. How is it in other European countries? So Europe passed several discussions and many years of discussions how to harmonize it, but finally we agreed just to sum up all the national experiences and adopt a report, an CPT-ECC report on national measures, and now it's a matter of consultation, so other countries can be inspired and consider whether this band is an inspiration for them. Next, please. Well, as in modern life and especially in spectrum management, as it has been already mentioned, algorithms are mainly implemented within software. We believe that there is one issue very important for Europe, or of course internationally. It's software sharing and software licensing. We believe that once a country develops a solution for a dynamic approach or whatever you want, I think it's an opportunity for other countries, because in Europe we need to foster the multi-country or maybe whole European prosperity or benefit. So we believe that a kind of open source license for the software is a good solution. In Europe we have the European Union public license, but in other countries or regions, I think that, for example, Mozilla public license is good and popular solution, so it's just for inspiration. Yes, here is also the issue of reciprocity. So once you release a software or a component or a library, somebody outside, it could be administration or an expert and developer, can improve that library. So it's the reciprocal benefit. Next slide, please. Well, 6 gigahertz in Europe. Since the last 3 years, Europe spent big efforts by discussions how to harmonize it, and finally the ECC decided on harmonization of the lower part of the 6 gigahertz band. So up to the frequency 6425 megahertz. It's harmonized for very low power and low power indoors. It means that outdoor only 25 milliwatts are allowed. Actually, I don't know about the activities on possible AFC algorithms, but maybe in future a country could consider it. Next slide, please. So I'm happy to see that within this summit we witnessed several nice ideas and experiences with the 6 gigahertz band, and within Europe we are now analyzing the agenda item 1.2 that is outcome from WRC conference in 2019. And the aim is to observe the possibility of the band for future IMT, the upper part for future 5G or IMT. Why? Because the IMT needs a further band within the mid-band range. So the studies are going, but here in the summit we see that there are also other opportunities, and I'm happy to see that some countries already adopted the RLAN harmonization or conditions within all the 6 gigahertz band, and some countries launched the public consultation. So I don't think it's necessary to explain the importance for RLAN. Next slide, please. Well, as the 6 gigahertz band for possible future RLAN usage is good idea to be studied, we agreed, or we are going to propose this idea into National Spectrum Plan. It will be a government plan. So nationally we will analyze that possible solution. But there is something very important. We would like to see wider European harmonization. So that's because the Czech Republic is quite small country. So we would like to maybe discuss this opportunity widely. So maybe within the responsible bodies, we can consider it in future. But we will see what happens. But PR funds not only of RLAN technologies. We would like to see also benefits from 5G. Therefore, the government launched a new project on 5G in 26 gigahertz band. So it's the European band. And one of the aims of the project is to find solutions how to dynamically assign the 5G stations. And we expect the results of that project or that observations will be released in 2023. Next slide, please. So to wrap up some ideas, of course, we in Europe will need high-speed connectivity because, for example, the studies on human behavior show that we live indoors 80 up to 90% of daytime. So indoor connectivity is very important for people. But to solve some spectrum sharing solutions, we will new technologies and technological regulation. We believe that license-exempt usage is a good candidate, but we will need a wide European interest. And we believe that the solutions can take into account realistic scenarios, because in Europe sometimes we base our decisions on worst case scenarios, but my wish would be to consider the risks rationally and to make good decisions for future, for the best connectivity. And finally, last point, we believe that sharing of open source solutions is one element of the solutions for wider European benefits. Thank you for your attention, and go back to Steve. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Pavel. I must say, coming from Mozilla, it's very gratifying to hear you mention open source software. I think that, you know, open source software drives much of the underlying infrastructure of connectivity, and as software becomes more of a dominant issue in terms of regulating spectrum, there's a missed opportunity here for open source to become a tide that raises all ships. Can I ask our other speakers to rejoin us here, and we will take one or two questions. Javier, if you are still there, there's a question for you on spectrum pricing. This is from Fernando Boron, and he says that you have mentioned that spectrum needs to be affordable, but however, the model for spectrum cost in Mexico relies highly on the payment of yearly spectrum rights established by Congress. Do you believe there's an opportunity to lower this cost based on the recent outcome of the elections for Congress and the new appointment of the Ministry of Finance?
Thank you, Steve. And thank you to Fernando for the question. That is a very important issue. That's why I pointed out affordability in my presentation. Actually, we have been trying to lower the fees. I mean, the fees that the spectrum users must pay each year. According to a benchmark we conducted a couple of years ago, these yearly payments are not the best practice, and Mexico has one of the highest. In fact, so far a service provider has already given back the spectrum since he thinks that it's so expensive. Previously, we have shared our views with the Ministry of Finance, and of course we will continue working with the new ministry and with the Congress. I think that each year we have a new chance to work in this issue. It's also important to point out that this is an example of the constitutional autonomy we have. I mean, we can share our opinions even if we don't agree with the government's point of view. That's very important. And I'm afraid that if we don't succeed in this issue, we will be less competitive in the near future. And as I said previously, that will affect the end users. Services could be less affordable. Thank you for the question.
Thank you, Javier. And we have a question for Pavel, and this is regarding the draft proposal from the Czech regulator to designate the upper 6 gigahertz to RLAN. And do you think that that decision might take place before WRC 23?
Well, thank you for that question. Yes, this is national government plan that will be matter of consultation this summer. So I expect that the final published report or the strategy will be released during autumn. So maybe once we see preliminary results, we can publish it because it's very important, and probably we will even inform the relevant bodies within Europe just to come up to the discussion about the possibilities of the upper part of 6 gigahertz band and to take appropriate stays at the stage, sorry, at the proper stage, because we are now in the beginning, and so far we have no final results on IMT in Europe. So I think it's good time to launch now some preliminary discussion just about the possibilities and studies and analysis. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I have a question for Shalini. Canada was very quick to follow suit with the United States regarding the opening up of the 6 gigahertz band, creating a huge ecosystem of opportunity for manufacturers and for service providers. Yet in mid-band, the strategies seem to have diverged in that Canada has chosen not to explore the tiered use it or share it approach that the US has taken with 3.5. Could you comment on that a little bit?
Okay, thanks, Steve, for the question. Yes, with ICED, the way we look at it is we treat it band by band, and particularly with reference to the CBRS band, as you point out, ICED did decide to go with the auction model. And I think we evaluated in that situation the pros and cons of choosing between going CBRS versus going with the auction. And ICED's opinion at that point in time was the going fully licensing the band was a better option for Canada.
Understood. Thank you. I would like, I have one more question, but I would like to invite the speakers to perhaps comment on what they heard this morning from their various peers in other countries. And my one other question is for South Africa, for Peter and Yulisa. One thing we heard from Brazil, the presentation from Brazil on the first day was their intention to introduce use it or share it provisions into their upcoming 5G spectrum auctions, which would allow for the secondary use of auction spectrum under the circumstances where it is clearly unused. Is this something that ICASA has considered at all?
I don't know if Yulisa, you want to go first, or do you want to jump in?
No, go ahead, Councillor.
Okay, great. Yes, Steve, thank you for that question. And yes, we do have in our spectrum policies, we do have the principle of use it or lose it, meaning which is quite a tough issue against operators, where they don't use the spectrum and also not holding the spectrum. But again, our spectrum process, the auction process, we looked at the different views on how do we ensure that operators do not just hold spectrum and so on. Again, we allow for spectrum sharing, and we are also looking at these principles of spectrum spectrum sharing in terms of use it or share it. So we also alluded to that within our invitation to apply for the auction. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Any comments from the presenters? Anyone, final remarks that anyone would like to make before we break? Javier?
Thank you, Steve. Just to thank you for the chance. These kind of panels, these kind of summits are very important in my view. We have the chance to hear from other colleagues from all around the world. In some ways, we have the same challenges, you know, all the bands, the challenges that they are facing in some way are quite similar to the challenges we have in Mexico. So just to say thank you for sharing their views. They are very useful for our daily work. Thank you very much, Steve.
Thank you, Javier. Yolisa?
Okay, thank you, Steve. Thanks to DSA for the invitation. I just wanted to mention from our side, I think we were not in a position to make quite a number of pronouncements. We are still in a process of updating our national radio frequency plan. The draft will be out very soon in few weeks. So we are soliciting views from the industry in terms of whatever decisions, for example, that have come out of the WRC 19. So for that reason, I think we are a little bit late in any way in updating the plan, but it should be out at the draft very soon. Yeah, so we were hoping to hear from the industry and everyone interested in our plan. Thank you so much, Steve.
Thank you. We look forward to that publication. A last word from anyone? From Glenn.
Thank you, Steve. Just to hear that when we are talking about the spectrum sharing, in this panel we have this challenge sharing in terms of the regulation challenges that we face. Just let me wish the best luck to Javier in the Mexico consultation. I hope that you can have the opportunity to have the full 1.2 gigahertz on the 6 gigahertz spectrum band of unlicensed spectrum. And also the best luck to Pavel. I think that he has a great challenge trying to get the upper part of the 6 gigahertz for Wi-Fi 6.6 also at his region, and please have the best opportunities. The harmonization is the best way for all the world to share the benefits of this band. Thank you very much. Thank you for everyone.
Thank you, Glenn. That's a perfect note to finish on. With that, I would like to thank you all very much for your excellent presentations, and we will take a break for 15 minutes and come back on the economic impact of spectrum sharing. Thank you.